All right, The Big Sort. It's been over 2 years since I read this book. I wrote out a whole review on it. Yeah, I actually feel like I recorded this already at some point and accidentally deleted it, but gonna give it another shot. I think this is an interesting book to talk about. So, yeah, The Big Sort. Today I'm going to talk for the first time in a while about a political science book, and one that is mentioned quite a bit in conversations today about the topic of political polarization. In fact, the first time I heard about it may have been around the time I read Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized, a few years ago. So the book is called The Big Sort: Why the Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart. And the title pretty much says it all about why people find it currently relevant. But the reason this one in particular keeps coming up is because it introduces this terminology of sorting, political sorting or political segregation. The book was originally published in 2008, so it's about 15 years behind the present day here in 2023, 2024, when I'm filming this video. The most recent election was George W. Bush versus John Kerry, and Obama gets one sentence of mention in the last 15 minutes or so. In fact, this timing probably had something to do with the book's appeal, because a lot of people the author knew who were living in politically blue states and cities. That means affiliated with the Democratic Party or the Liberals, for those not familiar with the American politics. A lot of people were wondering how on earth George Bush could have possibly won when they didn't know a single person who supported him. And I think many of us have probably had similar experiences in the years that followed, from both sides of the political aisle, as we saw candidates elected from either side, 2 from the Democrats, or really 3 if you count Obama twice, and 1 from the Republicans. So we've got Obama, Trump, Biden. You may not know of this book directly, but if you've read any articles or heard any discussions about political polarization, chances are you've heard references at least to this core idea presented within it. Bishop argues here that in the past approximately 50 years, Americans have become politically segregated. We choose to live among people who are like-minded and to move out of communities with people whose ideas make us feel uncomfortable. And being among others who agree with us on a few important topics then further reinforces these beliefs and also shapes our beliefs on topics we previously hadn't thought much about or only had weak opinions about. Bishop's main focus is on how this occurs geographically and has been a result of American migrational patterns, but he doesn't neglect to explore the ways in which other communities further reinforce this ideological fragmentation of society. And although I don't think Bill Bishop really foresaw the extent to which social media and virtual communities would further create and reinforce these boundaries and echo chambers, or even build them in new ways, those more recent developments have really taken political segregation to the next level over the past decade or two. So this core idea is that Americans are politically, ideologically, and culturally sorted, which is the term you might now listen for in other discussions of polarization if you haven't already. Sorting is similar but also a bit different from other types of segregation because it's not something that's entirely forced upon us. It's not mandated by law or even really a vestige of former laws. If you're a political liberal living in the more conservative city of Dallas, Texas, and you move to San Francisco, California, or maybe if you're a liberal living in a more conservative suburb of Austin, Texas, and then you move to a more liberal suburb like the one where author Bill Bishop resides, there's a good chance, according to Bishop, that this decision was at least partially influenced by your feeling more comfortable with the culture and ideas of that place you're moving to in comparison with the place that you're coming from. You weren't forced out of your old city. You chose to move to a place where you'd feel more comfortable and feel a stronger sense of shared cultural identity with the people around you. Now, you might be thinking, that's a bit of a stretch. I'm not that political of a person, and I didn't check the voting records before I moved to my new suburb. But Bishop makes the point that you don't even have to identify political reasons for moving. Your shared interests will simply make it so that you ultimately end up in a more homogeneous community. If politics is a weak part of your identity, but being a comic book writer is a big one, then moving to Portland to join its strong comic book writer community will effectively guarantee that you're among people who are more politically homogeneous, politically liberal, and your political views may shift to the median of the comic book writer group, even if you didn't originally think all that much about politics. particularly if the group that you identify with has also developed a strong political identity that goes along with its other interests. And I don't think it's entirely a bad thing that many people now have the ability to choose communities that cater to their particular beliefs and interests, nor does the author. But one very unfortunate effect of this is that unlike past generations who more often lived among people different than them and therefore had to be exposed to and learn from many ideas that conflicted with their own, modern Americans largely live within insulated communities where our own ideas are reinforced by those around us, and we rarely interact with people of other viewpoints. The more we stay within our ideological homogeneous communities, the more we feel confident that our way of viewing the world is correct, and the more uncomfortable it becomes to seriously consider perspectives outside of our own. So in this book, Bishop first lays out the evidence for this idea he calls the big sort, and that it's contributing to political polarization. He contrasts it with some other theories of polarization that he finds less convincing and less supported by evidence, and then from there he really delves into a bunch of different causes for this phenomenon, the many dimensions that have shaped these sociological shifts in where Americans live and how we think. It's a complicated picture with many facets, so much that while reading the book, I occasionally found myself even briefly losing the connection to how this all related to the big sort in the first place. But it really does all come together to form some bigger picture. At the end of the day, Bishop isn't really trying to prove that there's some law called the big sort that exists, just like gravity and electrons. He's simply proposing a sociological model that accurately describes many societal trends, and then he's exploring a variety of factors that he believes brought it about. So you might disagree with him on the extent to which some of these factors are contributors, but all in all, I found it a very insightful narrative of how we got to where we are today. Better yet, Bishop explores a variety of causes for sorting, and each in a decent amount of depth, which meant that a lot of his analysis was pretty new to me, even though I've heard already of this idea of the big sort. This didn't feel like it was just another book saying stuff I've already heard, nor was it one of those books where the author just comes up with one very simple idea and then attempts to fill a book with just saying the same thing over and over again in slightly varying examples. I also found the book respectful and genuinely open to the diversity of ideas around the United States. Even though Bishop's audience are probably more often liberal than conservative, it didn't feel to me like one of those books where the author attempts to explain to liberals why conservatives are just such irrational wackos or something of that nature. Bishop explores a lot of factors that he claims are causing political sorting. One of these, he argues, is a shift in fundamental American values. Though America has long embraced a culture of individualism, Bishop suggests that up until the mid to late 20th century, the top priority for most Americans was ensuring economic prosperity, whereas towards the end of the century, around 1970, I believe, there arose a greater focus on establishing one's own personal and somewhat independent identity, including a political identity. Beyond this shift in American values, though, Bishop also explores class divisions, development of the modern city, Americans at church, and fragmentation through marketing, all as factors contributing to political sorting. Bishop also attempts to debunk two explanations for sorting that are commonly cited but that he doesn't find compelling. One of those is gerrymandering, the deliberate drawing of congressional or voting district lines on the map for political gain. Bishop argues, using geographic and demographic data, that gerrymandering is an effect, or rather a possibility enabled by sorting rather than the other way around. It's easier to create politically homogeneous voting districts because Americans have become so sorted. This argument seemed sound to me, though I can't claim to have considered it in its full complexity. Furthermore, though, gerrymandering doesn't always benefit from having the most sorted districts possible. It actually benefits from having just enough voters in the district so that you're sure your party will win, but so that some of the voters for the other party get lumped into another district and their votes get diluted. If your district is 100% Democratic voters, then trying to preserve this district is actually counterproductive because your party was simply going to win here no matter what. Another argument that Bishop tries to debunk is that polarization arose specifically as a result of intentional strategies by influential Republicans to fragment and polarize the voter base, which some pundits have elevated almost to the level of a conspiratorial plot. Bishop argues that although evidence for some such organized efforts exists, this doesn't seem to have been an important driver of polarization, as it feels to him less like conspiracy and more like the party responding to actual real public sentiments, which to him is just how politics works. As Bishop basically puts it, it's a convenient out for liberals to just say that conservative voters are like sheep, fundamentally misguided by the Republican political establishment into believing ideas that are not really their own. But this explanation misses the fact that the people shape the party too. It's not just the party shaping the people to its own mold. Certainly there is a bit of both effects going on, but in any case, even if this propels polarization of political views, it doesn't necessarily influence geographical sorting. Although I should comment that at some points in the book, this distinction between mere political polarization and geographically centered political polarization becomes a bit fuzzy. This is especially true for readers in a time in which it's very possible to occupy homogeneous political communities online without ever being physically located anywhere near the same space. So now let's take a step back for a bit and view the book through more of a critical lens. In my eyes, the author maybe downplays the advantage of some polarization. For example, I don't think it's good for all of America to be moving to the radical left or alt-right, but I do think it's okay and healthy for some groups to exist that push the boundaries of conversation on either side, and that have the motivation to try to start these conversations and movements instead of just sitting slightly left or right of center and not having much impetus to do other than see where things go and course correct in tiny amounts. I think polarization becomes a bit more dangerous, though, when instead of minor polarization, where you have some fringe groups and a big center that's only subtly influenced by the fringe groups, you have the bulk of the national populace falling closer to the poles, with fewer people remaining with moderate or in-between opinions. And I think this becomes a problem because it reinforces a tendency to reject moderate opinions or even people who just have different opinions than their group for some of a wide range of issues and preferences. In this case, you might get something like so-called cancel culture, where conversation is shut down instead of being left open, and where you effectively are expected to align rigidly with a side or else be shunned by people on both sides, limiting the ability to have constructive conversations. What are some other common critiques that others have made about this book? One is that the book doesn't really have much to say at all about race. Ezra Klein explores race more in depth in his book Why We're Polarized, and I expect that others do too. In this book, however, it doesn't seem it was fully appreciated as a contributing factor to political polarization. It is mentioned as part of larger demographic discussions, but Bishop doesn't really dive into the ways in which coalitional shifts within the major political parties themselves, largely shaped by attitudes about racial segregation, really transformed the political spectrum in the late 20th century, at least if you believe that line of thinking. And I do find it pretty convincing, although I don't recall all the particular details. Similarly, some academic critics have challenged the entire notion that America is more geographically, politically polarized than it was half a century ago, most prominently of the ones I saw in an article by Samuel Abrams and Morris Fiorina. I'll provide a link to that article on JSTOR below, which if you're interested, you may be able to look around and find the PDF version shared by the authors. I myself am not going to delve into that debate right now because I really don't know to what extent Bishop's claim is or isn't supported by the underlying data. I think he makes a decent case for it in this book, but on the other hand, I do think it's a fair criticism that this book proposes an interesting theory, but doesn't really do quite enough to prop up that theory against alternative framings or explanations. One largely favorable reviewer on Goodreads described the book as written in a Malcolm Gladwell sort of way, which I take to mean that Bishop relies on individual anecdotes more than thorough statistics or a comprehensive picture to make his point. This is partially true, and it is potentially a problem since stories can be selected in a way to make whatever point you want. Yes, Bishop's anecdotes are interesting and relatable, and they suggest reasons why current sorting may exist, but they don't always provide concrete evidence that these societal shifts are the reason for sorting, nor that they increased geographical sorting beyond the point where it used to be. Many others agreed that sorting is occurring, but claimed that Bishop's direct focus on this one aspect of a big and complicated picture is unwarranted, even suggesting that maybe other trends warrant greater attention. In other words, this idea of the big sort makes for a great story, which is why everyone refers to it often, and that always means that we should be wary of it. Still, another reviewer points out that Bishop conveniently chooses a time in history to begin his analysis at which sorting was at its all-time minimum in the late 60s and early 70s, before the race conflicts and civil rights and segregation issues really reshaped the parties, and also at a time where World War II and the height of the Cold War had actually really unified Americans in spite of other differences against common enemies. Certainly, political sorting was also pretty common and strong in, say, the antebellum South, or the South before the Civil War, right? Well, yes, but I think Bishop would at least contend that mobility was different back then. You could live in a segregated state and you could hate segregation, but it still wasn't so easy to just get up and move. Though I also think Bishop here overstates the easiness of just getting up and moving from a place where your family has established roots, politically sympathetic or not. But I think overall this is a valid critique that sorting and polarization, if measured only from 1970 as an absolute starting point, must be considered really only within that context, as opposed to being some totally new phenomenon. A few reviews said this book was too complimentary of liberals as opposed to conservatives, a sentiment which they felt because of Bishop's comments, for example, that the liberal cities are producing the most patents, are meccas of creativity, etc. I disagree with these criticisms, and more than revealing some partiality to Bishop's reporting, I think they actually just reveal what the reviewers place value on. If you think that it's the highest possible praise that mostly liberal communities are producing more patents and are more creative and diverse, and you can't see any value in the counterpart, that conservative communities have stronger family lives, stronger communal bonds, and community support structures, then I think this is already illustrating how your values have been shaped by or have governed your values and the places that you value living in. Bishop sees various possibilities as valuable. He isn't claiming one to be better than the other. He's just emphasizing that there are differences in what people value. That's why I maintain that Bishop is actually very sympathetic to both liberal and conservative perspectives in this book, and doesn't show great preference for one over the other, nor does he try to communicate that conservative perspectives differing from his own are wrong. In fact, aside from the first chapter in which he describes the community in which he lives and the reasons he chose to live there, Bishop's own political views hardly come through transparently in this book, which I think is great. Bishop is far less perturbed by the fact that America has elected George W. Bush as president than he is by the fact that the people who voted for Bush and the people who voted for Kerry can't even have a decent and civilized conversation about politics. Finally, given that an additional 20 years have passed since the writing of this book, we can question to what extent Bishop's thesis still holds, if it ever did. While I believe that political polarization is as present as ever, it's not clear to me that it even needs much geographical sorting to occur anymore. In an age where an increasing proportion of our lives are lived not in person, but online, it's possible to be sorted in the online space even while living in a fairly politically diverse or opposing community. Like, my apartment building could be one of the most politically diverse groups of people there are, but in an age where people are less likely than ever to even know or interact with their neighbors, this feels a lot less significant than it was at the time of Bishop's writing. So, should you read this book? If you're interested in the topic, then yes, I think so, but it depends a bit on exactly what you're looking for. This isn't a fast-paced book. It's interesting, but some chapters focusing on statistical analysis of demographic data, particularly the first chapter, are actually quite slow. And given that they come earlier in the book, they even had me pretty bored because I'd already gotten the point without exploring every angle. I mean, sure, the data presented there is important, but there's just a lot of it here for a general audience. And you get the sense that the data being presented is all in support of the author's view anyway, so it's important to have this data, but you also can't just take it entirely at face value. Also, you should know that this book is really more about the origins of the big sort than exploring the implications of sorting, particularly since any of Bishop's reflections on its implications have probably already shifted in the 15 years since publication. Which makes the subtitle of this book, Why the Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart, a bit of a clickbait title, because this book is more accurately about why Americans are clustering in like-minded groups, with limited exploration of whether or how this is tearing us apart, so to speak. You also have to really be not just prepared, but eager to make these long forays into various dimensions of American society, with full chapters devoted to American values, class divisions, development of the modern city, Americans at church, fragmentation through marketing, and many others. I found each of these explorations interesting, and each provided ample resources for me if I wanted to dive any deeper into that topic. But because of this, it's really not a book for someone who just wants high-level takeaways. And finally, don't go into this book expecting conclusive answers or some kind of definitive framework of how this all works. The fact is, it's really complicated, and although this book will give you a deeper insight into this proposed phenomenon of sorting, it won't give you understanding with a capital U. There are a lot of moving parts here, and what Bishop does is he zooms in on a lot of these parts to let us sort of see how they work, and then he zooms back out into what, at least in his assessment, is this complicated system that produces the effect of sorting, along with other effects. But yeah, all that said, I thought this was worth the read. In conclusion, Bishop's book is intriguing and suggests many possibilities, even though he doesn't bring all the points home and doesn't seem to have connected all the dots himself at the time of writing. Hopefully the writers and academics he's influenced have since worked on connecting some of these dots over the next 20 years of US political analysis, or in some cases on disputing Bishop's central claims where they don't really hold up. Even as we think about Bishop's model of geographic segregation to explain some political and cultural phenomena, I think we should be careful about placing too much weight on it or considering it some sort of absolute truth, since at minimum it's just one view into a complicated system, and according to some criticisms, it might not even be the most valid or useful explanation. I'm not going to be the one to make the call on that, though, so I'll let you be the judge. Happy reading.